The smell hit her before anything else. Bitter almonds beneath the sweetness of polished wood and leather. Faint, almost imperceptible, threaded through the cold morning air like a lie told softly. Maisie had learned that smell the hard way. She had learned most things the hard way. She was carrying a tray of spiced wine when she stopped walking. The inn's courtyard was loud with the noise of arrival. Horses stamping, wheels grinding against cobblestone, the sharp commands of outriders in dark cloaks bearing the king's seal. Half the staff of the Amber Stag had spilled out into the gray morning to watch, pressing close to the walls with wide eyes and poorly hidden excitement. A royal procession. Here, in Veldmore, a town that had not seen anything of consequence in 11 years. Maisie did not press close to the walls. She stood at the edge of the covered walkway, tray balanced against her hip, and stared at the black carriage at the center of the convoy. It was beautiful in the way that dangerous things sometimes are. Lacquered obsidian panels, gold fittings, curtains the color of dried blood drawn across the windows. The horses pulling it were enormous, gray as ash, their breath misting in the cold. The carriage had arrived sealed. No outrider had opened the door. No one had stepped out. And from somewhere inside it, she was almost certain, came that smell. Bitter almonds, sweet rot underneath. The particular quiet violence of nightshade oil blended with something she could not name but had tasted once before. In a cup of tea her stepmother had pressed into her hands the morning after her father's will was read. She had not drunk the tea. She had not been able to explain why. Her body had simply refused. It refused now, too. Her feet would not carry her forward. Her hands tightened on the tray until her knuckles ached. Do not open that carriage. The thought arrived the way those thoughts always did. Not as reason, not as memory, but as something older than both, rising from somewhere beneath her ribs like a hand pressing upward against her sternum. She had never known what to call it. Her mother, before she died, had called it a gift. Everyone else in Maisie's life had called it inconvenient. One of the outriders dismounted. A tall man, broad-shouldered, with the silver insignia of the king's personal guard at his collar. He approached the carriage door with a key already in hand. Maisie moved before she decided to. She crossed the courtyard in 10 steps, tray still in her hands, and put herself between the guard and the carriage door. The man stopped, stared at her. Around the courtyard, the whispered noise of the gathered staff went abruptly silent. She was aware of how she looked. A serving girl, 23 years old, in a linen dress with a faded hem and an apron that had been washed so many times the embroidery had almost disappeared. No status. No name worth saying aloud. Hair coming loose from its braid in the wind, holding a tray of wine no one had asked for. "Step aside," the guard said. His voice was flat and certain, the voice of a man who had never had to ask twice. "There's something wrong with this carriage," she said. The silence in the courtyard deepened into a different kind of silence. "Step aside," he said again. His hand moved to the hilt at his belt. Maisie did not step aside. She held the guard's eyes and kept her voice as steady as she could manage, which was steadier than she expected, given that her entire body was vibrating with something between terror and absolute certainty. "The smell," she said. "Can you not smell it?" He could not. She saw it in his face, the brief, dismissive flicker that told her he thought her either mad or troublesome, and had not yet decided which was worse. 2 more guards had turned their horses toward her. The innkeeper, old Fenwick, had appeared in the doorway behind her, with an expression she recognized, the particular horror of a man watching an employee commit professional suicide. She did not move, and then the carriage shifted. Not the rocking of a man adjusting position, a slow, deliberate turn of weight, the sound of a body that had been very still for a long time choosing, carefully, to move. The curtain at the nearest window stirred from the inside. A hand appeared at the glass, large, dark-gloved, pressing flat against the pane. Then a voice, low, and roughened at the edges, like stone that had been smoothed by weather but not softened. "Open the door from the outside," it said. "Do not let me do it myself." Every guard in the courtyard went rigid. The one in front of Maisie took a single step back, and for the first time she saw something move across his face that was not dismissal. It was controlled, practiced fear. The fear of a man who had been trained to manage it rather than show it. She understood in that moment that the man inside the carriage was not simply a passenger. Old Fenwick made a sound behind her that was nearly a word. The guard looked at her, then at the carriage, then slowly reached into his coat and withdrew a cloth, thick, dark, pressed to his nose before he moved. He gestured sharply to two others who dismounted and flanked the door. Then he turned the key. The door swung open. The smell rolled out like a wave. Even through her distance, even diluted by the cold morning air, it hit the back of Maisie's throat like something with teeth. Several people in the courtyard coughed. One of the younger stable hands stumbled back into the wall. The man who stepped out of the carriage did not stumble. He was tall. Taller than she had expected, which was already tall, and broad in the shoulders in the way that came not from armor, but from the body beneath it. Something dense and contained, and entirely deliberate about the way he carried himself. His coat was the color of midnight, double-breasted, with no insignia she could immediately identify. His jaw was set. His eyes, when they found the courtyard, swept it with the particular efficiency of a man who had learned long ago that the world could turn hostile at any moment, and had decided to always see it first. He was pale. Not the pallor of cold, but the pallor of something working against him. The faint sheen at his temple. The careful way he held his right hand slightly away from his body, as though the arm did not entirely belong to him at the moment. His eyes found her. She had put herself directly in his line of sight. There was nowhere to look except at her. She did not look away, though every reasonable instinct she possessed was suggesting that she do exactly that. He studied her for a moment that lasted longer than moments should. Something moved in his expression. Not warmth, not gratitude, not anything she could easily name. Closer to assessment. The way a man looks at something unexpected that has not yet revealed whether it is useful or dangerous. Then he looked at the guard who had opened the door. "How long," he said, "was I in that carriage?" "7 hours, Your Majesty." "Your Majesty." Maisie's tray tilted. She caught it before the cup slid, but only barely. She had stopped the king's guard from opening a poisoned carriage. She had put herself in the path of the personal escort of the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, and told him he was wrong. She had done this in an apron with a faded hem, in the courtyard of a middling inn, in a town that no one of consequence had visited in over a decade. 7 hours, the king repeated. His voice was still level, but she caught something move beneath it, a leashed, controlled anger that did not need volume to be frightening. And no one detected it. The lining was treated, sire. The oil was applied to the interior panel seams. It would have been undetectable from outside the vehicle. The guard's voice was clipped and professional, but his neck had gone red above his collar. "We will investigate later." The king's eyes returned to Maisie. She should have looked down. She should have retreated 3 steps and made herself small, which was what she had spent the last 4 years learning to do in this inn, in this town, in a life that had slowly shrunk itself around her like a room with walls that kept moving inward. She did not look down. "Your name," he said. "Maisie," she said. "I work here." A long pause. "I can see that," he said. Something in his expression shifted. Not a smile. Nothing so readable as that. But a fractional release of tension at the corner of his mouth that might have been, in a different kind of man, the beginning of one. "Come inside," he said, and walked past her toward the inn's door. It was not an invitation. It was not quite a command either. Not the flat, unquestioned authority he had used with his guard. It was something in between, which somehow made it harder to refuse than either would have been. Fenwick grabbed her elbow as she turned to follow. His fingers were shaking. "Maisie," he hissed. "What have you done?" She looked at his hand on her arm. She looked at the door the king had walked through. She thought about the smell of the tea her stepmother had given her. She thought about how the wall of her room had moved another inch inward last week, and another the week before, and the week before that, and how she had been pretending not to notice. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, and followed the king inside. The king had taken the inn's only private room without asking for it. This was not arrogance, exactly. It was simply the way a man moves through a space when he has never had to negotiate his presence in it, with a kind of quiet certainty that rearranged the room around him rather than adjusting himself to fit it. By the time Maisie crossed the threshold, his coat was already over the back of the single chair, 2 of his guards were stationed outside the door, and old Fenwick's best beeswax candles had been lit on the writing table, filling the room with the warm smell of honey and smoke. The king was standing at the window with his back to her. His right hand, she noticed again, was resting against the window frame with slightly too much weight on it. The sleeve of his shirt had been pushed back to the elbow, and even from across the room she could see the faint discoloration climbing the inside of his forearm. A dull, bruised greenish gray, spreading upward from the wrist, like ink, moving slowly through water. She set the tray on the table. He did not turn around. "How did you know?" he said. Not how did you notice. Not what made you suspicious. He had already moved past those questions to the one that actually interested him. "The smell," she said. "Guards with 20 years of service did not smell it." "I know." A pause. "That is not an explanation," he said. Maisie looked at the back of his head. He had dark hair, cut close at the sides and longer at the crown, and he held his neck with the kind of stillness that did not come from relaxation. He was in pain. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the rigid line of his spine, the posture of a man who had decided discomfort was not permitted to be visible, and was enforcing that decision through will alone. "I've smelled it before," she said. "Nightshade oil. Someone used it on me once." Now he turned. His eyes in the candlelight were darker than they had seemed in the courtyard, a deep amber brown that caught the flame and held it. He looked at her with the same quality of attention he had used before, the kind that took inventory without asking permission, and she resisted the familiar urge to make herself smaller under it. "Someone used nightshade oil on you," he repeated. "They blended it with lavender. Put it in tea." She kept her voice flat. "I didn't drink it. I've never been able to explain why. My body knew before I did." Something shifted in his expression. Not pity. She would have closed like a door against pity. Something more considered than that. He looked at her the way someone looks at a thing they have underestimated and are quietly revising their position on. "How long ago?" he said. 4 years. "And the person who did it?" "My stepmother." The word sat in her mouth, with the particular weight of things that have been carried a long time without being set down. "She wanted my father's estate. She got most of it anyway. The magistrate in this town is her cousin." The king said nothing for a moment. Then he crossed to the chair, sat down with the careful economy of movement of a man managing something his body was doing against his will, and said, "Sit down." There was only one other place to sit, which was the edge of the bed. Maisie sat on it and folded her hands in her lap and waited. "The carriage was prepared 3 days ago," he said, "in the capital, which means someone in my household, in my inner circle, arranged this. Not a stranger. Not an enemy at the border." He paused. "Someone who knew my route. Someone who knew which carriage I would take. Someone who knew I prefer to ride sealed on long journeys because I use the time to read. She said nothing. It was not her place to speak yet. The oil would not have killed immediately, he continued, with the detached clarity of a man thinking aloud rather than confiding. 7 hours of exposure, absorption through skin and breath, both. By the time we reached Veldmoor, I would have been too weakened to shift, too weakened to fight. He looked at his forearm. If you had let my guard open that door from the outside, if the air had cleared before I stepped out, I might have walked into this courtyard and collapsed 20 minutes later, in public, in front of the full escort, without ever knowing what had been done to me. The fire in the small hearth across the room snapped. Someone wants you to look weak, Maisie said. His eyes moved back to her. Yes, he said. Not just dead. Weak first. In public. Yes. She thought about that. It had a particular cruelty to it, the kind that came not from hatred, but from strategy. Killing a king made a martyr. Watching a king collapse, visibly, without explanation, in front of his own guard, that made something worse. That made a question. That made doubt, spreading quietly through every lord and council member who witnessed it, growing in the dark the way doubt always does. There's an antidote, she said, for nightshade oil, if it's caught early enough. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. The healer in this town, she continued, is a woman named Petra. She's old and she's difficult, and she will not come to you, but she'll come to me. She worked with my mother when I was young. She knows plant compounds. She'll have what you need. My physician travels with the convoy. Your physician, Maisie said carefully, is part of your household. A silence. It was a presumptuous thing to say. She was aware of that. She was also aware that she had already stood between a royal guard and a king's carriage in a faded apron, so presumption was perhaps no longer the largest obstacle between herself and consequences today. The king's jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger at her, she thought, but anger at the truth of what she'd said, which was a different and worse thing. Send for the woman, he said. Maisie stood. She was almost to the door when his voice came again. Do not tell anyone else in this inn what you saw, not what you smelled, not what you know. A pause. Not yet. She turned. He was watching her from the chair with that same unreadable quality, controlled, present, taking in more than he showed. The person who arranged this, he said, may have arranged to receive news of it as well. If word reaches them that something went wrong, they'll move to cover it. I need them to believe it succeeded. Maisie thought about that. She thought about living in a town where the magistrate was her stepmother's cousin. She thought about what it meant to hold information that someone powerful wanted buried, and what it had cost her last time. I understand discretion, she said quietly. Something in his expression shifted again. That fractional thing at the corner of his mouth. I believe you, he said. She went out into the corridor and pulled the door closed behind her. The 2 guards watched her pass without expression. She walked through the common room, past the kitchen, out the back door and into the alley behind the inn, and stood for a moment in the cold air with her back against the stone wall, and her eyes closed. Her heart was hammering. It had been hammering since the moment she crossed the courtyard, and it had not stopped, and she was only now allowing herself to feel it, the full, delayed weight of what she had done. She had walked up to the Alpha King's escort. She had blocked a royal guard. She had sat on the edge of a bed in a room with the most powerful man in the Northern Territories, and told him his physician could not be trusted. She had also, almost certainly, just saved his life. The thought did not bring the relief it should have. It brought something else instead. A low, persistent unease, the feeling of a stone dropped into still water, the ripples already moving outward in directions she couldn't yet see. She pushed off the wall. Petra lived 20 minutes' walk from here, near the edge of the mill district, in a house that smelled like dried herbs and old smoke. She would not be pleased to be summoned. She would come anyway. Maisie pulled her shawl tighter and walked. Behind her, in the upper window of the Amber Stag, a candle burned steadily in the gray morning. She did not look back at it, but she felt it, the way she sometimes felt things, at the base of her neck, beneath her skin, like a pressure that had not yet decided what it was going to become. Petra came. She came the way she always did everything, without hurry, without warmth, with a worn leather satchel over one shoulder, and the expression of a woman who had seen too much of the world to be impressed by any particular piece of it. She was 60 years old and small, and her white hair was pinned up with what appeared to be a carved bone needle. And when Maisie opened the back door of the inn and said the king is here, and he's been poisoned, Petra looked at her for a long moment, and then said, "I'll need hot water and a clean basin. Tell them not to touch him with metal instruments until I've assessed the compound." She said nothing about the king. She said nothing about fear. Maisie had always loved her for that. They went up the back stairs, away from the common room where Fenwick was managing the convoy's outriders with visible desperation, plying them with bread and salted pork, and trying not to make eye contact with anyone above the rank of sergeant. The two guards at the king's door stepped aside when Maisie knocked and gave her name. She did not know when she had become someone whose name opened doors, and she did not examine it too closely. Inside, the king had not moved from the chair. He had, however, pushed both sleeves back, and the discoloration on his right forearm had spread. It reached the inside of his elbow now, and a faint corresponding gray had appeared along the side of his neck, just below the jaw. He looked at Petra the way he looked at everything, with assessment and no visible alarm. And Petra looked back at him the way she looked at Patience, which was to say she looked at the arm and not at the man. "How long since exposure began?" she said, setting her satchel on the table. "Approximately 7 hours. Any numbness?" "In the fingers. Some. Difficulty drawing full breath. A pause. Occasional." That is not an answer. Something that was almost surprise moved across the king's face. Maisie suspected very few people spoke to him in that tone. Petra was not most people. "Yes," he said. "Difficulty drawing full breath." Petra made a sound that communicated neither reassurance nor alarm, which was somehow worse than either, and began unpacking her satchel. Bundles of dried herbs, a small stone mortar, 2 vials of dark liquid, stoppered with wax. A folded cloth soaked in something that smelled sharp and resinous, like pine stripped to its heartwood. "Sit forward," she said. "I need access to the back of the neck." The king sat forward. Maisie moved to stand near the door, out of the way, and watched Petra work, the quick, certain movements of someone whose hands had long since outpaced the need for thought. The cloth was pressed to the back of his neck, held there. He did not flinch. One of the vials was opened, and the contents added to the hot water Maisie had brought. And then Petra said without looking up, "He'll need to drink this, and then sleep for at least 4 hours. The compound breaks down faster in rest. If he shifts while it's still in his system, it will accelerate the spread, and I cannot help him after that." "I don't intend to shift," the king said. "I wasn't asking your intentions. I was stating a fact." Petra finally looked at his face. "You're Alpha King of the Northern Territories. I assume you understand the difference." Another almost surprise. Then, quietly, something that Maisie thought might, if given sufficient time and different circumstances, eventually become respect. "I understand it," he said. Petra handed him the cup. He drank it without hesitation, which told Maisie something about him. A man who trusted no one in his household, but would drink without question what a stranger healer gave him. because the logic of the situation had already established that the stranger was safer than the familiar. He was not reckless. He simply recalibrated quickly. While Petra repacked her satchel, the king's eyes found Maisie across the room. "You'll stay," he said. It was the same quality as before. Not quite command, not quite request. The thing in between. "In the inn," she said carefully. "In this corridor," he said. "My guard cannot be trusted until I know which of them are compromised. You," a pause, brief and weighted, "have already demonstrated that your instincts are reliable." Maisie looked at him. She thought about Fenwick's face. She thought about the afternoon shift that was already an hour behind, and the tables that needed clearing, and the entirely reasonable life of smallness she had been carefully constructing around herself as a form of protection. She thought about the smell of lavender tea and how she had not drunk it. "I'll stay," she said. Petra passed her on the way to the door and paused, just briefly, with one hand on Maisie's arm. A pressure, small and sure, that said several things without saying any of them. And then she was gone. The king slept. She did not expect that. The simple fact of it, the way a man of that much controlled power could close his eyes in an unfamiliar room and go under, trusting the compound to do its work. She sat on a wooden stool in the corridor outside the door and listened to the inn settle around her. The distant noise of the common room, the wind against the upper shutters, the occasional stamp of a horse in the courtyard below. The guard to her left was named Edric. She learned this because he was young enough that silence made him uncomfortable, and after an hour he said his name and asked hers in return. She gave it. He told her, in a carefully neutral tone, that the king did not usually allow civilians in secured corridors during rest periods. "I know," she said. "He must have his reasons," Edric said, in the tone of someone reassuring himself. "He does," she agreed. An hour after that, the door opened. The king stood in the doorway. He looked better. The gray had retreated from his neck, and he held himself with more ease. The careful economy of his movement restored to something approaching its natural state. He looked at her on the stool, and then at Edric, and then back at her. "Come inside," he said. She went in. He closed the door. He did not sit. He stood at the window again, but differently this time, without the weight against the frame. The afternoon light had come through while he slept, thin and pale through the gauze curtain, and it caught the dust in the room and made the space feel briefly warmer than it was. "I need to know everything you know about this town," he said. "The magistrate, the people of influence, anyone who might have received a message this morning, anyone who might be watching the inn, anyone who has reason to want news of a dead king." Maisie folded her hands. "That's a long list. Begin at the beginning." So she did. She told him about Veldmoor, its two competing merchant families, the old guild that still held unofficial power over the river trade, the magistrate whose name was Aldrich Combe, and who had been her stepmother's cousin for 30 years, and her stepmother's instrument for 4. She told him about the Combe family's connections to the southern trade routes. She told him, carefully, about her father, Lord Edwin Holt, a minor territorial lord with a modest estate and a significant archive of historical land grants, who had died of a sudden illness 3 months after remarrying, leaving everything to his new wife under a will that Maisie had never been permitted to read. The king listened. He did not interrupt. He stood with his arms crossed and his eyes on a point slightly past her shoulder, the way people look when they are not watching but thinking, and she had the distinct sense that he was filing every word in some internal architecture that was considerably more organized than her own. When she finished, silence settled. "Your father's land grants," he said. "Historical ones. How old?" She looked at him. "Some go back 300 years. My father spent his life collecting them. He said they were—" She paused. "He said they were worth more than the land itself, eventually. That the right document in the right hands could shift a border." The king was very still. "Where are they now?" he said. "In my stepmother's house, in the archive room my father built." Maisie kept her voice even. "I have not been inside that house in 4 years." Something had changed in the room. She could feel it, a shift in the quality of his attention, a sharpening that had not been there before. He looked at her now, directly, and there was something in his expression that she couldn't immediately name. Not alarm, not sympathy. Something more like the moment before a long-held calculation finally resolves. "Maisie," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. It moved through the room differently than she expected. "The convoy that was supposed to carry news of my death south," he said slowly, "was scheduled to pass through Veldmore by nightfall, through the magistrate's district." A pause. Someone was waiting for confirmation. And whoever arranged this, whoever treated that carriage, knew about those land grants. I am almost certain of it. The fire in the hearth had burned low. Outside, the wind had picked up, pressing against the shutters with a sound like something wanting in. Maisie looked at the man across the room, the Alpha King, poisoned and recalculating, standing in a middling inn in her small ruined town, and felt the ground shift beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the particular vertigo of a life that has just, without warning, changed direction. "What do you need me to do?" she said. The plan was simple in the way that dangerous things sometimes are. The king would remain in the inn. His condition, improving steadily, the gray entirely gone from his neck by evening, the feeling returned to his fingers, would be kept from the convoy. Edric, whom Caius had assessed and decided to trust on the basis of 12 years of service, and the particular way the young guard had positioned himself near the door during Petra's examination, would manage the outer cordon. The rest of the escort would be told the king was resting after a difficult journey and would resume travel in the morning, and Maisie would go to her stepmother's house. "You don't have to," Caius said. He said it once, plainly, without softening it. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," she said. "I'm asking because the archive is relevant to what's happening, not because I have the right to ask it of you." She looked at him for a moment. It was a strange thing to say. The careful delineation of right and request, from a man who could have simply told her to go and had it done. She filed it away in the place where she kept things that surprised her, which had been a fairly empty place for the last 4 years. "What am I looking for?" she said. "A document, a land grant specifically, one that covers the territory between the Veld River and the Northern Mill District. If the dates are what I suspect, it predates the current charter by 60 years. That document, in the wrong hands, is the legal foundation for a border challenge." He paused. A challenge that would require the sitting king to be dead, discredited, or incapacitated to proceed unchallenged. Maisie was quiet for a moment. "My father knew what he had," she said. It was not a question. "I think he may have been killed because of it," Caius said. The fire snapped. The room held the words carefully, the way rooms sometimes do. She had known, in the way she knew most things, below the level of proof, above the level of doubt. She had known since the morning she watched her stepmother accept condolences with dry eyes and an expression of composed grief that fit too well, the way a dress fits when it has been made in advance of the occasion. She had known, and she had had nothing. No document, no witness, no magistrate who would look at her without her stepmother's interests already occupying his eyes. "When I come back," she said, "I want the document." Caius looked at her. "Not for you," she said. "Not only for you. I want a copy. I want it witnessed. I want what my father built to be accounted for." On record, under a seal that Aldrich Combe cannot touch. A long pause. Agreed, he said. She went out into the dark. Her stepmother's house was a 20-minute walk through Veldmore's narrow streets, past the mill, past the Chandlers, down the long lane where the houses grew larger and the hedges taller, and the light from the windows fell on stone paths instead of dirt. She had walked this route thousands of times as a child. She walked it now with her shawl pulled up and her head down, and the particular invisibility of a serving girl after dark, which was considerable. The house was lit. Several windows. Her stepmother was awake, then, or entertaining, or both. A horse Maisie didn't recognize was tied at the post near the garden gate. A courier's horse, she thought, lean and travel-worn, with mud on its legs that had not yet dried. News had already arrived, or was arriving now. She did not go to the front door. The archive room was at the back of the house, on the ground floor, accessible through the garden. Her father had built it that way deliberately, she had always thought, so he could reach his books without disturbing the household. She went around the hedge, through the kitchen garden, and found the archive door where it had always been. Iron-banded oak, the lock the same old 3-lever design her father had installed 20 years ago. She still had the key. She had kept it the way she kept most things that mattered, quietly, without discussion, in the lining of the small bag she carried everywhere. She had not consciously decided to keep it. She had simply never given it up, the way her body had never permitted her to drink the lavender tea, some deep-seated part of her insisting on a future she couldn't yet see. The lock turned. The door opened. The smell of the archive hit her like something she had not known she was still grieving. Old paper, leather bindings, the particular dry sweetness of a room where a man had spent the best part of his life being quietly, seriously interested in things that mattered to him. She pressed her hand flat against the inside wall and breathed for a moment. Then she lit the small tallow candle she had brought and went to work. Her father had organized his archive with his own system, which he had explained to her once when she was 12, and which she had retained the way she retained most things he had taught her. Not because she had studied it, but because she had loved him, and the things people love enter them differently than the things they merely learn. Third shelf, eastern wall, grants predating the Second Territorial Charter. Rolled documents in bone casings, labeled in his careful hand. She found it in 11 minutes. The casing was plain, unlabeled, which was unlike her father, which meant he had deliberately chosen not to label it. She opened it and unrolled the document by candlelight, and read it slowly, her lips moving slightly, translating the old formal script. It was exactly what Caius had described, 60 years before the current charter. A grant covering the Veld River corridor and the northern mill district, extending to the old forest boundary, an enormous tract of land, the control of which would shift significant tax revenue, trade rights, and territorial authority away from the crown. The seal at the bottom was old, but intact. The signatures were legible, and in the lower margin, in an ink slightly fresher than the rest, was a notation she did not immediately understand. A name, a date, and 2 words, already transferred. She stared at it. The date was 3 weeks ago. The name was not her stepmother's name. It was a name she did not recognize, Lord Fenyon Voss. She had never heard it. But below the notation, in handwriting that she did recognize, her stepmother's thin, slanted script, was a single additional line. Pending confirmation of primary event. Primary event. The death of the king. Maisie rolled the document carefully, replaced it in the casing, and slid it into the inside of her shawl against her body. She blew out the candle. She stood in the dark archive for a moment and listened. Voices. Inside the house, closer than they had been, coming from the direction of the corridor that connected the archive to the main hall. 2 voices, one of which she recognized immediately as her stepmother's, precise and carrying. The other was male and unfamiliar, and he was saying, with considerable agitation, that the convoy had stopped in Veldmore for the night, and there had been no news, no courier from the guard, nothing. "Patience," her stepmother said, in the tone she used when she wanted someone to understand that she was not patient herself, but expected others to perform it for her. These things take time to confirm. He would have been weakened, not immediately incapacitated. Wait for the morning report. The buyer will not wait past tomorrow midday, my lady. If the document cannot be delivered with confirmation of... I said patience. A door closed. Maisie stood absolutely still in the dark. The buyer. There was a buyer. The document had already been transferred, or the transfer was already arranged, and someone was waiting for confirmation of the king's death before it was finalized. Which meant this was not simply a conspiracy inside Caius's household. This was a transaction. Organized, financed, coordinated. Someone outside Veldmore, someone with enough wealth to purchase a 300-year-old land grant and the political consequences that came with it, had been waiting for a serving girl in a faded apron to let a guard open a carriage door. She had not let him. She went out through the garden the way she had come, carefully, without sound, and walked back through Veldmore's dark streets toward the inn. The wind had died. The town was quiet around her, its windows going dark one by one, entirely unaware that the ground beneath it had been shifting for months toward something that would have changed everything by morning. She came through the inn's back door, up the back stairs, and knocked twice on the king's door. It opened immediately. He had not been sleeping then. He stood in the doorway and looked at her face and did not ask if she was all right, which she appreciated, because she was not entirely sure she was, and did not want to be asked to evaluate it. She held out the document. "There's a buyer," she said, "and my stepmother is waiting for confirmation that you're dead." Caius took the document. He unrolled it in the candlelight and read it in silence, and she watched something move across his face that was not the careful neutrality he maintained as a default. Something colder, more deliberate. The expression of a man who has confirmed a suspicion and is already 3 steps into what comes next. "Lord Fenian Voss," he said quietly. "You know him." "He sits on my Eastern Council." A pause. "He has sat on my Eastern Council for 9 years." The candle between them burned without flickering. "I need a messenger I can trust," he said, "not from the convoy." Maisie thought for exactly 2 seconds. "Edric," she said, "and I know where to send him." The message went out before dawn. Edric rode south with 2 letters, one in the king's seal, one in plain wax with no marking at all. Maisie did not ask what the letters said. She had told Caius where to send them. A loyalist lord 3 hours south, whose name she knew from her father's correspondence. A man her father had described once as the kind of person who does not change sides because he never chose a side for convenience in the first place. Caius had listened to that description, and then written the letters without hesitation, which told her that the name was already known to him and already trusted. They waited. The morning passed with the particular slowness of mornings that carry weight. Maisie worked. She carried trays, cleared tables, moved through the common room with the careful unremarkability she had spent 4 years perfecting, and listened. The convoy's outriders were restless, talking among themselves in low voices about the delayed departure. The king had not appeared. Word had been given that he was still resting. Some of them accepted this, some did not. She identified by mid-morning the 2 who did not. They were not obvious about it. They ate their food and drank their ale and looked at nothing in particular, but they looked at nothing in particular with a very specific quality of attention. The attention of men waiting for news they expected to receive, growing uncertain because it had not arrived. She noted their faces. She noted which direction one of them glanced when Fenwick's boy came through the door with the morning bread delivery. Not at the bread, but at the boy's hands, checking for a folded note that was not there. She brought this to Caius. He was sitting at the writing table when she came in, The land grant document opened before him alongside 3 other papers she did not examine. He looked up when she described the 2 guards, and something in his expression shifted. A compression, swift and controlled, that she had come to recognize as his version of anger. "Names," he said. She gave him their descriptions. He matched them to names himself, quietly, and wrote them down. "When Edric returns," he said, "I'll need them separated from the others before they can send word south. If Voss receives notice that the arrangement has failed, he'll destroy evidence and be across the eastern border within a day." He paused. "There's also the matter of Combe. Aldrich Combe, the magistrate, her stepmother's cousin, who had presided over her father's estate proceedings with the particular corruption of a man who had confused official authority with personal loyalty for so long, he could no longer see the difference. "What do you want to do about him?" she said. Caius looked at her for a moment. "What do you want to do about him?" She had not expected the question. She sat with it for a moment, feeling its shape, not its answer, which she knew, but its shape, the fact that he had asked it at all, the fact that he had handed it to her instead of answering for her. "I want him to answer for what he did to my father's estate," she said. "Publicly, in writing, under a seal that cannot be revised later. That can be arranged. I want my father's archive legally documented as the Holt family collection. Not my stepmother's property, not the Crown's, the family's." She paused. "Whatever is left of the family." Caius held her eyes. "Done. And I want my stepmother." She stopped, took a breath. "I don't want her destroyed. I want her corrected. I want the estate returned to proper accounting, and I want her removed from any legal authority over my father's name." A pause. "She had him killed. I can't prove it, but I know it, and you know it, and I want the record to at least stop pretending she was something she wasn't." The room was very quiet. "The record," Caius said carefully, "will reflect the fraudulent transfer of a royal land grant, coordination in a conspiracy against the Crown, and obstruction of territorial law. Your stepmother's role in those charges will be documented. The rest," he paused, "the rest will follow from that, in time. Justice rarely arrives complete, but it arrives." Maisie nodded. Her throat was tight, but she did not look away. "You should know," he said after a moment, "that Voss did not act alone. There are 2 other council members implicated in the correspondence I've been reviewing. This reaches further than Veldmore." He said it plainly, without softening. "You are a witness to the primary evidence. That makes you relevant to proceedings that will take place in the capital." "I'm a serving girl," she said. "You were a serving girl," he said. "You are currently the woman who preserved material evidence in a conspiracy against the Crown and delivered it intact under considerable personal risk." A pause. "Those are not the same thing." She looked at him. He looked back at her, steady and certain, and she thought about the distance between those 2 descriptions, the one she had inhabited for 4 years, and the one he had just placed in front of her, and felt something inside her that had been held very tightly for a very long time begin, slowly, to release its grip. Edric returned in the early afternoon with a company of 40 riders bearing the Loyalist Lord's colours and a sealed warrant from the nearest territorial court. It was fast, faster than she had expected, and the look on Caius's face when the riders came into the courtyard told her that he had known the response would be swift, had planned for it, had perhaps been building toward exactly this kind of moment for longer than one poisoned carriage ride. The 2 compromised guards were separated quietly, without incident, before they understood what was happening. Aldrich Combe was brought in from his office near the mill within the hour, accompanied by 2 of the Loyalist riders, and an expression of profound indignation that collapsed into something considerably smaller when he saw the king standing in the courtyard of the Amber Stag, entirely alive, with the land grant document in his hand. Her stepmother came later. She came because she was sent for, and she came composed, dressed well, chin level, the performance of innocence assembled with the expertise of long practice. She looked at Maisie once, in the courtyard, and the look contained everything it always had. The flat assessment, the faint contempt, the particular quality of a woman who had decided that Maisie was an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be reckoned with. Then she saw the document, and she saw Caius, and the composure did not shatter. She was too practiced for that. But it cracked, just slightly, along the edges, and that crack was enough. The proceedings were formal and swift. Caius presided with the focused economy of a man who had spent years in council rooms and had long since stripped the process down to its necessary elements. The document, the notation, the correspondent's name. The courier who had ridden in the night before, located now in a room at the back of the inn, and considerably less composed than he had been, who confirmed the arrangement in full in exchange for a reduced accounting of his own role. Combe broke before the courier finished. He spoke for 40 minutes. Everything. The estate proceedings, the forged will addendum, the arrangement with Voss that had begun 2 years ago when Voss had come to Veldmoor on a hunting trip and had dinner at her stepmother's table, and had seen the archive, and had understood, with the instinct of a man who had spent years looking for exactly that kind of leverage, what it was worth. Maisie stood at the back of the room and listened to the shape of her father's death assembled in front of her, piece by piece, in other people's words. It was not what she had imagined. She had imagined it would feel like the end of something. Instead, it felt like the last page of a book. Not an ending exactly, but a completion. The story reaching the place it had been moving toward all along. Afterward, when the room had emptied, and the formal documents had been signed and witnessed and sealed, Caius found her in the corridor. She was sitting on the same wooden stool she had occupied the night before, outside the door that was no longer a guarded threshold, but simply a door. The afternoon light came through the window at the end of the corridor and lay across the floorboards in long, pale rectangles. He sat down beside her, not across from her, not above her, beside her, on the floor, his back against the wall, his long legs extended. It was such an unlikely posture for a man of his gravity that she looked at him. He was looking at the window. Voss will be taken into custody at the Eastern Estate by nightfall, he said. The other 2 council members by morning. The transfer document is void. Your father's archive will be formally registered under the Holt name within the week. He paused. Your stepmother will face full tribunal proceedings. Combe has been removed from his post. A temporary magistrate will be appointed pending review. Maisie was quiet. Your father built something worth protecting, Caius said. He deserves someone who would protect it. He had me, she said. I just didn't know enough yet. You knew enough yesterday. She looked at her hands. The faded apron was gone. She had taken it off at some point and forgotten to track when. She was just herself, in her plain linen dress, sitting on a stool in a corridor that smelled of beeswax and old wood. What happens now? She said. To the proceedings. They continue without you, largely. Your testimony has been recorded. You'll be contacted by the tribunal in due course. He paused. To you. That depends on what you want. She had not thought about what she wanted in 4 years. She had thought about surviving. She had thought about staying small enough not to be targeted again. She had thought about the walls moving inward, inch by inch, and how to bear it. I want to go back to my father's house, she said. It surprised her. She had not known it until she said it. Not to live in it the way I did before. Just to walk through the archive again. To see it properly. To make sure it's all right. Caius nodded. I'll arrange an escort. I don't need... Not for your protection, he said. For the documentation. Someone needs to officially inventory the collection before the legal registration is complete. A pause, and then, very quietly, And I would like to see it myself. Your father's work. The documents he collected. He looked at her. If you'll allow it. She looked at him for a long moment. The amber in his eyes in the afternoon light. The steadiness in him. That quality she had been circling since the courtyard, trying to find the edge of it, the place where it ended, or revealed itself as performance. She had not found the edge. She was beginning to think it did not have one. All right, she said. They went together the following morning, through the streets of Veldmore, past the mill and the chandlers, and the long lane with the tall hedges, and they walked through her father's archive in the thin winter light, while a royal clerk recorded every document, and Caius stood at the eastern shelf and read, in silence, for a long time. He did not try to explain what had happened between them. He did not name it or claim it or move toward it faster than she was moving. He simply stood beside her, in the room her father had built, and was present in the way that some people are present, completely, without division, as though there is nowhere else they would consider being. She did not fall in love with him in that room. Love, she had learned, was not a moment. It was a slow accumulation of evidence that a person is exactly who they appear to be. But she began, that morning, to stop looking for the evidence against him. In the months that followed, the tribunal convened in the capital, and the charges were heard, and the verdicts were recorded in the official chronicle of the Northern Territories. Lord Fenian Voss was stripped of his council seat and his eastern holdings, and spent the remainder of his life in supervised exile, his name removed from the territorial register. The 2 compromised guards were dismissed from service and tried separately. Aldrich Combe lost his post, his pension, and the house her stepmother had furnished with her father's money. Her stepmother herself was convicted on 3 counts: fraudulent transfer, conspiracy, and complicity in the arrangement that had cost Lord Edwin Holt his life. She was confined to a small property in the western lowlands, far from Veldmore, far from any archive, far from anything she could use. Maisie was there for the verdict. She sat in the gallery of the tribunal chamber, not in the back, not in the shadows, not making herself small, and she listened to her father's name spoken correctly, with the dignity it deserved, and she let herself feel the weight of it. Petra, when she heard the full account, said only, "Your mother would have been unsurprised. It was the highest compliment she had ever given." Maisie took back her father's house. She lived in it. She opened the archive to scholars and historians who wrote to request access, and she answered their letters herself, and she learned gradually that she had inherited not only her father's collection, but his particular gift for knowing what a document meant and why it mattered. Caius came to Veldmore 3 times in those months, and each time he stayed longer than the time before, and each time the space between them was smaller, not closed, but honestly reduced, in the way that distance closes when 2 people choose, consistently and without theater, to move toward each other. The 4th time he came, it was not as a king on official business. He stood at her door in the early evening with no escort and no formal coat, and the particular expression of a man who has decided to say something true and is not certain how it will be received. She opened the door and looked at him and said, "I know." "You know?" he repeated. "I've known for a while." She stepped back to let him in. "I was waiting to be sure I was ready." "And are you?" She thought about 4 years of shrinking. She thought about a courtyard in gray morning light and the smell of bitter almonds and a decision made in 10 steps that had changed everything. She thought about her father's voice in the archive, explaining his system to a 12-year-old who was paying attention because she loved him. She thought about walls that had stopped moving inward. "Yes," she said. He came in. She closed the door. Outside, Veldmore settled into the quiet of an ordinary evening. The mill silent, the lane empty, the light going slowly out of the sky in long bands of amber and gray. In the archive, her father's documents rested in their bone casings on their careful shelves, preserved and recorded and finally, completely safe. The story of Lord Edwin Holt's life's work did not end with his death. It ended here, properly catalogued, legally protected, known. And his daughter stood in the warm light of the house he had built, and was no longer afraid of the walls.